Allahu Akbar.
Assalamu alaikum. Not one of you truly believe until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Pay your worker before the sweat on his brow dries. Thou shalt not steal. Indeed, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, our core values are all the same. And yes, what unites us is so much more significant than what divides us. Interfaith worker justice started 16 years ago with the mission of engaging the religious community in low-wage worker issues, intentionally Christian, Jewish, Muslims, together working. And thank you, Naeem, for your support and for serving on our board of directors and helping guide us in our work. Now, historically, we worked on supporting the rights of workers to join unions and to get a fair contract if workers so wished. We also worked on raising core standards, so raising the minimum wage, working on paid sick days, core standards in the society. But after we'd been started for a few years, pastors, imams started sending to us workers, and the number one problem they had was they hadn't gotten paid. We started calling that wage theft. So I want to talk with you this afternoon about what is wage theft, why do we have wage theft, and more importantly, what can we do about it? So what is wage theft? Wage theft is when an employer illegally steals money from workers. It is not paying the minimum wage. 1 out of 4 low-wage workers in this country is not paid the minimum wage, and the laws are clear. 3/4 of low-wage workers who work more than 40 hours a week and are owed overtime don't get paid it. And indeed, many middle-income workers are not paid their overtime as well. That's 1.5 times the regular wages over 40. Now, not everyone is covered by overtime, but most workers are. And right now, employers say to workers, oh, I don't pay overtime. You want overtime? Go find another job. Then there is not paying the last paycheck. So if you work, you're supposed to get paid. But when workers get fired, laid off, or resign, too many employers simply don't pay that last paycheck. Then there's tip stealing. So 10% of tipped workers, particularly in restaurants, have their tips stolen. My favorite restaurant in Chicago is a restaurant called Tank Noodle. And I went to Tank Noodle one day, and I went to put my tip on the credit card. I turned to the waitress, and I said, if I put this on the credit card, will you get it? No. No. Not long thereafter, I ordered from my favorite Indian restaurant, a place called Viceroy in Chicago. And I went to pay for the food, and then I gave the delivery guy the tip in cash. Unannounced, unprovoked, he said to me, thanks for giving me the tip in cash. I often don't get it if it goes on the credit card. Tips are stolen from workers. Then there is shaving hours. So workers work after they clock out, or they come in early and work before they clock in. Or like Walmart, the nation's largest employer, the managers went into the time records, and when workers said they worked 42, 43 hours, the managers shaved off the hours and said they only worked 40 hours. Walmart has settled 65 class action lawsuits for stealing wages. Then there is payroll fraud. This is when an employer lies about actually having workers and calls them independent contractors when they are clearly not independent contractors. This not only steals from workers, it steals from the public coffers, and it means that ethical employers who are paying workers fairly are undercut by those committing payroll fraud. Then there are kickback schemes. A friend of mine is the new head of the Department of Labor in Illinois, and he said they followed construction companies that had been getting prevailing wage, right? So they had gotten government contracts and promised that they would pay the prevailing wage. They were driving their workers to the check cashing places. They would cash the checks and then give kickbacks to the employers, right? There's kickback schemes around in our nation. And I have to tell you, every time I think I've heard it all in terms of wage theft, I hear another story. We have a workers' center in Syracuse, New York. And early one morning, they got a call to come to the emergency room at the hospital. They went to the hospital, and the translator said, "You need to hear these workers' stories." There were 19 workers who were cooking at the New York State Fair. They not only had burns up and down their arms from the hot oil, but they had tick bites and bed bug bites all over their bodies because their employer had them in 2 trailers. They were working 70 and 80 hours a week, and he was not paying them, and put them up in trailers that were filled with bed bugs and ticks. So the workers were in the emergency room to deal with the bites and burns all over them, and the medical staff said, "These workers are all malnourished." They were cooking at the New York State Fair, and their employers were stealing their wages. It was, in fact, labor trafficking right at the New York State Fair. The average low-wage worker loses $2,600 a year in unpaid wages. That's a lot of money. You know, you do the rough calculations on that, and I think a reasonably defensible estimate is that $106 billion a year is stolen from workers in wage theft. It is indeed an enormous crisis in our country. So why do we have such a crisis? Well, clearly it is greed without adequate pushback forces, or as my colleague said, a value system based on profiteering. So the pushback forces against this used to be unions, right? But unions used to represent 30% of workers. Now they represent 10% of workers. And so they are not the pushback forces that they used to be in society. The Department of Labor ought to be a pushback force, but there's only 1,000 investigators to protect 130 million workers in the country. There's not enough investigators to protect us all. It ought to be ethical employers who are standing up and challenging what's going on, but I'm afraid many of them are missing in action on this issue. And so we have a crisis, and into this breach have stepped the faith communities and a new form of worker centers, a new structure for helping challenge this. So what are the faith communities and worker centers doing against the crisis of wage theft? First, they are going directly to employers who have stolen wages and asking them to pay their workers back. Let me tell you how that works. So in Chicago, there's a restaurant chain called Homemade Pizza. And some workers who put the pepperoni on the pizzas and make the pizzas were concerned about the quality of the pepperoni that they were being asked to use. They thought it was stale. And so they complained to the employer and said, you know, we want to not put this on. The employer immediately fired a group of them and said, don't tell me how to run my business. And said, and for the trouble you've given me, I'm not going to pay you your last paycheck. So the workers found their way into our workers' center. And as we got looking at their pay stubs, we realized not only had they not gotten their last paycheck, but they hadn't gotten overtime pay, and some of them weren't paid the minimum wage. So 3 clear violations of the law. So we called the employer and said, you know, is there a mistake here? Well, by his language back to us, we realized it wasn't a mistake. And so we organized. So we sent out, my staff sent out little texts around to people and said, show up at 6 p.m. on Tuesday night at one of these handful of homemade pizza restaurants, and we're going to try to send a message about paying workers. So I showed up. We had a group of folks outside handing out flyers that said, don't buy pizza topped with exploitation. And then we sent a delegation inside to meet with the local managers. When we talked to them, we said, call the owner and tell him to pay the workers who he fired. Well, a half hour later, we got a call from the owner yelling at us for disrupting his business. He said, I want to meet with you. A couple days later, he comes to the office with his attorney, and his attorney says, you know, you really do have to pay these workers. A couple days later, he paid the workers. That's direct action and how it works. You know, we have in Austin, we have a workers center, and they have prayer teams. And so when particularly a construction worker comes in and he usually, sometimes she, hasn't been paid, they call the employer and try and find out if there was just a mistake. But if not, they send the prayer team out to the person's home. They knock on the door, and when the person answers the door, they say, look, we've filled out all these forms to file a complaint with the Department of Labor, and we can do that. But why don't you just go ahead and pay these workers, and we're going to pray on your doorstep until you pay them. You know what? The workers usually get paid. So direct action is one of the things that we're doing around the country. We're helping workers file complaints, we're strengthening enforcement, we're educating workers, and we are honoring ethical businesses. And so today, I want to conclude with a few things that you can do to help stop wage theft in our society. One, you can join Interfaith Worker Justice's Action Alert list. Recently, the Department of Labor issued a regulation extending coverage to home care workers, a very important regulation, and they asked for comments on it. There were 6,000 comments sent in. 1,500 of them came from Interfaith Worker Justice, standing with home care workers. So join our Action Alert Network to be involved in these issues. You can go to iwj.org and sign up online, or you can give me your card or your information on a scrap of paper. Get involved with us. Second, tip in cash if you don't know how workers are paid. And if you want to know, just ask them, if I put this on my credit card, will you get it? And if you don't get an answer that feels good to you, just pay it in cash, because tipped workers don't get paid. Third, ask how workers are paid. In your home, your mosque, your business, if you're hiring people, particularly in residential construction, landscaping, janitorial. These are all sectors that are rife with wage theft. So if you're hiring people, you better be asking how workers are paid, and if they're not being paid right, you need to find another company. 4, educate members of your mosque. If you have young people in your mosque, if you have immigrants in your mosque, I can assure you, you have workers in your mosque who are not being paid, because young people, young workers, and immigrants are often victims of wage theft. And so in your mosque, do a Know Your Rights workshop. We've got a wage theft PowerPoint. We've got high school curriculum. Educate people in your mosque. 5, invite federal or state Department of Labor folks to your MAS to figure out how you can collaborate on these issues. 6, join an interfaith group or a worker center around the nation. There's 60 or so of these groups around the country that are affiliated with Interfaith Worker Justice, and another 140 or so not, but there's plenty of them around. And finally, stand up with workers. It is not okay to allow employers to steal. So if you or your friend or somebody has had their wages stolen, find out how you can stand with them to try to get those wages back. Because if it happens to your friend or your son or daughter, it will happen to somebody else. Liberal capitalism in America in 2012 is failing workers. If you work, you should get paid. Too many workers are working and having their wages stolen. It is indeed a national crisis, but you and I together can stop it. And when we stop wage theft, we will put money back in the hands of workers and their families. We will help communities. We will be supporting ethical businesses, and we will increase tax revenues for our communities. And what better way to stimulate the economy than to stop wage theft? Thank you so much.